much, Manana, for this critical remarks. It's quite what I expected from you, and it's very good, very useful. Before opening up the discussion to all of you, I would like to give the panelists the opportunity to comment on each other, and I would like to propose kind of two questions for the second round. One is the problem of credibility again, and Charles' idea that we might be needing two tracks, one handling with committed governments, governments who want to promote a democracy agenda, and one with non-democratic, more or less authoritarian governments where you need to at least find kind of basic standards. Would that help to be perceived as being more credible? And the second question is the question of how to reach out to societies. What Manana mentioned now with civic education, what Charles mentioned with the question how to reach out to the conservative part of society and the church in particular. What are your ideas on these topics? Who would like to start? Adrian again, maybe?
Maybe I just want to make the point that what comes also from the discussion is that there is a clear point being delivered that there is a conflation of the notion of democracy with these entities that we associate with the West. So there are the geostrategic elements, and there are economic interests, and then there is democracy. And this comes to the front that whenever we talk about these entities, this is the association. So there should be this distinction being clearly laid out, and then forcefully maybe make the claims that democracy is important, and these claims should be made. But I think we should keep this in mind all the time, that there are these three elements that we should associate with the West, so that there are no false sort of expectations being laid out, and also the idea of capabilities of these entities. And I think that for me this is what comes out, and more engagement is the notion that also how to reach to the society. More engagement and more substantive engagement of these entities, of these organizations, of these programs, eliciting much more discussion, not only through projects, but also eliciting more and more discussion about what are the issues at stake in the region and how to revive this. So I think these are the points.
Thanks. So I'm going to start with the second one about restoring civil society. And I have 2 points here. I'll try to be brief because I know you've been listening for a long time. I may have one because I can't. Okay. The first is to recognize the breadth of civil society. And we too frequently, it's tempting to define civil society as those NGOs that we like, and those organizations that bring citizens together to do things that we like. And if we do that, we define ourselves out of relevance. And the second point I would make is that I don't know. I don't know how you meaningfully engage with civil society. I've worked all over the world on this issue, and I've read and I've written about this extensively. I know that it's very, very difficult. And maybe that's where you start, right? Life is tough, and it's a lot easier when you begin to recognize it's tough. And this is true with civil society development too. Recognizing that we're just scratching the surface, and we have to really rethink this and really dig into the long haul if we want to do this. Might make it a little bit easier, but it might not, but it's going to be difficult. The credibility question, this goes to the very core of the work we're trying to do here. And again, part of it is recognizing that I think people in Georgia or Azerbaijan or Armenia, they don't expect the West to just be altruistically interested in their democratic development. They recognize that these are states or multilateral or groups of states, in the case of the European Union, that have their own interests. And a little more honesty and a little more frankness might actually restore some of our credibility. And the second thing I would say is the two-track proposal that Charles brought up, What concerns me is that how you define that country becomes very political. I'm quite certain that if we did pursue that it would be determined that Azerbaijan is a government that wants to become democratic, and we just need to help them. And the reason is the reasons we know. So I think that it becomes a very, other than say North Korea or Cuba, you know, or some countries like that, the gray area, where countries fit in the gray area, and where we see them in that gray area, the kind of, all those countries that are either semi-democratic or semi-authoritarian, or kind of soft authoritarian, has a lot more to do with where they fit into our, and here I mean our, the West, I'm not just saying the US, interest in what their actual internal political structures look like.
That is a very reasonable point, I think, and we saw a concrete instance of that where there was pressure to, I believe, from the State Department, but not resisted by the founders of the World Democratic Movement to admit Azerbaijan a few years ago. I think it partly addresses that problem if the kind of two tracks I talked about are quietly defined by policymakers and not put in the form of official lists, because there will soon be pressure to admit North Korea to the list of countries that want to be democratic, given the Washington environment. I would not have phrased my suggestion as governments committed to democracy versus others, because the problem with the national movement government was that I think initially they probably were committed to democracy. But as they became unpopular, the temptation to use the resources of the state to replace their waning popularity became overwhelming, and their foreign patrons did not make that a difficult choice. So I would rather say that there are some countries where democracy is really feasible. I think it was feasible, particularly after the early years of state construction in Rose Revolution, Georgia. It's not feasible in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, and if there is political change, which there surely will be, it's likely to take the Syrian or Yemeni scenario rather than the Georgian one. So, I mean, that's just to restate the basis for that arguable policy suggestion.
Thank you very much. Jana?
Just very briefly on the question of credibility. I mean, I think it is an important question, but at the same time we need to recognize the limits of Western influence in the countries. No, it's one thing about what we do, but whether that will actually have any real impact on the development on the ground. And you know, are we more credible in the eyes of Belarusians because we impose sanctions on the regime? No, Belarusians don't know about the sanctions. We have to engage with governments, including in the Caucasus. I think what would help our credibility in the region is that whilst engaging with the government, perhaps we don't have to fund Congos. Perhaps we can speak out about other things, not just about the energy security and so on. But you know, I'm not sure there is a kind of blueprint based on which you can come and say, okay, you do this and we do this. On civil society, I mean, I just want to echo what Lincoln said about how we perceive the civil society, and the EU is really good in talking to partners that talk the EU talk. But that's not the whole of civil society, and I think we need to seriously think about how we expand the definition of what we understand as civil society. And that has been the case in all over Eastern Europe. We talk with NGOs and partners, particularly on EU issues, on kind of more political areas when it comes to corruption, monitoring of the government spending, and so on. We don't really talk or engage in kind of grassroots or interest-based groups that are actually part of civil society. How can we engage the groups of teachers, doctors who are interested in how the EU does things or the West does things, and they are willing to learn and engage. And I think that's what will create the ultimate link that will bind this region closer to the EU rather than the political level only. And I don't think we're thinking of that.
Do you allow me one short reaction concerning, yes, we have to engage with government. I'm often wondering, EU delegation in Baku, negotiating agreements on a reform agenda with the Azeri government and spending European taxpayers' money. How must they feel there? What are they speaking about? What do you think?
I talked to them and they don't feel really happy about it. There's going to be a change in the leadership of the delegation very soon, so we might see some changes. But as I said, I mean, the trouble is that we are in this black and white mentality where we either engage with government but don't really criticize them at all, or engage with the civil society but then don't talk to the government, which is the case in Belarus. And we can get out of this binary reaction. We can do it in Azerbaijan very easily. But I'm saying, that's what I was saying. Like the fact that you talk with the government does not mean you need to support government. And that's it.
I want to comment about the critiques, which is really, really important because, and Charles mentioned this article in the Washington Post, the problem with the critiques is that sometimes we don't hear any type of the critiques and sometimes we hear too much. And then if I will give the ordinary person perception, it looks very crazy, And we even have this joke in Georgia, now they will be again concerned, It means that some governments will be concerned. But the critiques is maybe not about the critiques, but the feedback should all times go from the governments to the governments of the other countries. And the feedback doesn't mean that you are criticizing heavily and you say, it's just the feedback that this action is not fully complies that or that law or this kind of things. And it should be the evidence-based, because what we see right now, there is really limited instruments to do this kind of the structural dialogues between the civil societies, governments, and between the international community. What we usually see is that there is the bilateral consultations, and then the government always, I assume, giving very nice understanding to the concerns of the civil society, which have been brought day before. The same human rights dialogue itself, which is used, it's very good exercise. The problem is that it may work in Georgia, but for sure it will not work in Azerbaijan and in Uzbekistan, if we speak frankly. So again, in this situation, the EU delegations should find, or the any embassy should find some other means, and this means can be found only with the broader consultation, not only, like Lincoln said, with the NGOs we like, but also with those we don't really like because their values is not matching with us. But they should be involved in this dialogue in a way to find some consensus at the end of the day.
One more remark by Charles?
Yeah, I understand it perfectly, and I'm sure I've said the same, but I'm a little impatient with the notion we have to engage with governments. In 1903, 110 years ago, in the bad old days of Bismarckian realpolitik, a military faction killed the King of Serbia and all his family, and every European great power immediately withdrew its ambassador from Belgrade and kept them away for quite a long time. I think I think in the years, at least months. And there are so many cases. Effective policy for democracy and human rights needs to begin with countries that are not important to us. And I'll tell another story, which is to me terribly sad. When the first post-communist alleged democratic president, later emerging to be a dictator of Kyrgyzstan, conducted one of his massively fraudulent elections long before we had a military base in Kyrgyzstan. I asked Steve Sestanovich, why didn't we do anything except complain? And he said, well, I wanted to deny Kyrgyzstan exemption from the Jackson-Vanik amendment, but Senator Brownback was against it. Well, Senator Brownback was a Republican, and Kyrgyzstan was a country in which we had no interests to speak of except democracy. And we have to be serious sometimes. There are cases, China is certainly one of them. Kyrgyzstan is one of them now, but wasn't then. Azerbaijan might be one of them, where we have powerful interests and we can't show our displeasure, but we rarely show it with anybody.
Thank you. We have now already a speaker system. We have about 45 minutes for discussion. We will collect a couple of questions and then come back to the panel and then again collect new comments and questions. The first one is Adrian. Please.
Thank you, and thanks to all of panelists, and special thanks to Manana and Kochladze. Her position I share very much, really. My long question contains some comments as well. So the issue of Western and American aid and assistance to Georgia is beyond any question for me, because I believe that without such kind of aid and assistance, my country wouldn't survive just. So the issue is about how effective was this aid and assistance, especially in the field of democracy. And this was mainly, at least it was articulated as an American aid and assistance. And I would like to raise two issues, and mainly my question goes to Lincoln, but maybe to Charles as well. Let's take two fields. Somebody said yesterday that we have in Georgia civil society organizations, but we don't have civil society and such, and I agree very much with that statement. So, Lincoln, what's the dynamics from 2003 and 2013? You see, you were here in 2003 and you are now here in 2013. And the second issue is also the issue of the special attention of mainly American organizations. This is the issue of intra-party democracy. And I would say that we have only one party here in this country, and I insist, only one party with some level and traditions of intra-party democracy. So again, what is the dynamics that you observe in this field for last 10 years? Another issue is that now Western, maybe mainly European, but not only European donors are literally running after former officials, many of whom have established NGOs after losing the elections and losing their positions in the government, and begging them, please take money from us. You see. They are begging to take money from them, the people who did not care about democracy in this country for 9 years when they were in the power, who actually contributed to ruining political pluralism in this country, or at least were such, at best were silent, and who ignored civil society or civil society organizations and tried to implement instead bongos with whom they cooperated happily. And the last, my question, and not quite a rhetoric question. I am interested, what has NDI done to dramatically improve the quality of their polls, especially in the political electoral part? Because we all know that these shameful polls, they misled international community, and they undermine the trust of local population in the Western institutions.
So the Caucasus as a region. Mr. Fairbanks' take, it's clearly after the historical periods of the Russian Empire, Soviet Union, post-Soviet period, South Caucasus went, there's no region exists. And I understood this information regrettably, but the inhabitant of South Caucasus. But this is emotion only. To avoid the emotions, my question is that if we are region, what would be practical income or achievement the inhabitants of the South Caucasus will receive if we are region? Thank you.
I would still like to go a bit deeper into the question of this general approach, a very cumbersome and at times even very hypocritical approach towards the region, not just the South Caucasus, but the whole post-Soviet region as such. And to me, it's been very telling thing that, for example, the notion of transition still exists. You know, this big notion that emerged in the 1990s, that is teleology of the authoritarianism turning into liberal democracy and planned economy turning into market economy. This discourse is still very much alive, not only in rhetoric of the government, but also in NGOs like Freedom House still puts out this annual report, Countries in Transition, and yet in that report you can read that Central Asian countries are even more authoritarian and totalitarian to some respect than they were in the Soviet times, and they are not transiting anywhere. It's very much consolidated authoritarian state. It's similar trends we can observe when it comes to Azerbaijan. So why has it been so difficult to start adopting a little bit more nuanced and honest, like you mentioned, you raised the concept of honesty, which I find very bitter and very telling. Why is it so difficult to break through this narrative and this very generalized approach? And the same thing we can say about Georgia, which was hailed as beacon of democracy by the United States government very openly and very clearly, whereas this most important basic element of democracy, the rules of the game, division of power, checks and balances, was completely ignored throughout the 9 years. And because of this problem, I think we are right now are in a very politically dangerous situation, that we have one man with immense economic power who saw it happen, that came also into the political system, and now he's overseeing the political system that is also sort of structured around, if not like one man, but at least 4 or 5 decision makers. The court, the judiciary has to be built from the scratch. The parliament is now trying to find its place. There is no political system, and that problem was never really addressed. Instead, Georgia was hailed as one, big and most highly intensified case of democratization. And of course, the credibility is going to be weakened, because people here are not stupid, and they can very much see how shiny that beacon was. So just, it's also not only rhetorical question that I'm trying to ask. Why is it so difficult to be more honest and more nuanced and really start addressing the very, very pressing issues, even at the political level? Let's leave aside the civil society for a moment.
Start because the gentleman who asked essentially what's in it for the people here of the South Caucasus is a region. That's the right question to ask. It doesn't matter if there's another journal, Politics of South Caucasus, or if we begin to have more conferences on it. What's in it for the people here? Nothing if we start calling it a region. There might be things in it if it starts acting like a cohesive region, but that's a different thing, right? So I have these two very easy, brief questions on democracy, so I'll just breeze through those. If you want to chat more, maybe, I'm here at least till early tomorrow morning, I'm happy to talk. So I called my paper dropping in to see what condition the transition is in, because there was an old rock and roll song, What Condition My Condition Was In, which was like kind of a British invasion band from the 1960s. And I meant that kind of as a joke, because a little tongue-in-cheek, where we're obsessed with this notion of transition. But that nuance sometimes gets my nuance there got lost, I think. But this question of why, the answer is if we don't think of these countries as being in transition, then we have to ask a whole lot of more difficult questions. And I mean collectively, whether you're in academia, whether you're in policy, whether you're in the think tank, the foundation world, if they're not in transition, what are they? They're consolidated regimes of some kind or another. But moreover, trying to move a transitional country towards democracy is a very easy thing to explain. This is a country, there's something movement going on there, it's going to end up here or there. Let's push it here, because here's the right place, here being democracy. And I agree with that. Wait, hold on. The problem is that if they're not in transition, then to move a country that is a consolidated non-democratic regime towards democracy means making much stronger political change. And our democracy promotion business, except for the occasional Iraq, is not in that business, right? So the reason we call them in transition has nothing to do with actually analyzing regimes. It has to do with the set of conclusions that follow from the regime assumption. So we call them transitions because it makes our life easier to call them transitional. That's why. The second question is, speaking of democracy, why? I mean, one thing that the answer to that, there's a much longer answer, but I'll give you the shorter answer, not because I'm trying to be disrespectful, but I think it answers the question succinctly. So if you teach in a place like where I do, you can take seminars on what is democracy, right? And if we talk about democracy long enough, we eventually have to answer that question. And when we're in the United States, when I'm in the United States, I actually carry my preferred definition of democracy in my wallet so that I can read it at events like this when people ask. But you can also see it on my Facebook page. But in Washington, there is a very clear definition of democracy. If you are under 50 and speak English, you are a Democrat, full stop. And that is why we call this regime a beacon of democracy. And I don't mean that in a wise apple way, in a dead serious way. Okay, so these are very easy, short questions. About the dynamic with regards to civil society between 2003 and 2013. And what struck me is that there were eerie similarities and eerie differences, and notable differences between the two. The civil society in 2003 had kind of outpaced the state in the degree of its organization and strength. That was not the case in 2013, or 2012, I should say, in 2012. So that was one major difference. Both of the events, the Rose Revolution election 2012, were led by political parties and politicians more than a lot of the historiography has recognized. So that I don't see as a big of a difference. Like it or not, I mean, I joke with people sometimes that 10 days before the election, in 2000, maybe 5 days before the election in 2003, my colleague and friend Mark Mullen who some of you may know, who worked together at the time, got an urgent call from the U.S. Embassy, and so we said, okay, well, meet with you, absolutely. We went to the Marriott, back when there was only one, and we were basically told, you know, you guys are way too close to Saakashvili. You're working too closely with him, you know, we don't like this. And we said, all right, you know, we hear you. So then events happened. I went back for a few days so my son could interview for kindergartens in New York. And I came back in mid-January, went to a meeting at the embassy. Mark and I said we were together again at this meeting, and we were asked about the new constitutional reforms. And Mark, who's not here, and I'm speaking positively of him, so, you know, welcome to share this anecdote with him. Mark started to kind of delineate some of the problems, which were essentially the concentration of power in the hands of one person, which was very obvious then. And he was not getting a warm reaction from the U.S. government officials there. So Mark, being a friend and important colleague, trusted colleague, I decided to intervene and help him. So I kind of waited for my moment. I kind of half interrupted him and I said, well, Mark is focused on the substance, but what's really troubling is the process. And I talked about it, how quickly they rammed it through, how there was no debate, and within 30 seconds we were back in the parking lot in Mark's car, driving back to our office, wondering how we screwed up the meeting so badly. That's a great anecdote. I forget where it was coming from. But so the dynamic in 2003 was that this was, it's a misstatement to say that the U.S., and this is something that people get wrong, the U.S. was not trying to make the Rose Revolution happen, but the structures they put in place kind of had momentum of their own. And they did contribute. In 2012, it was, I think it's different. On the one hand, would the 2012 events have happened without U.S. support? I'm not sure they would have. Now, I think in a different way. But there was a lot of quiet U.S. money going to really important work. ISFED, for example. The parallel vote tabulation the day after the election. I mean, there was many, and I've written about this, there were many. But the parallel vote tabulation by ISFED was important. And it was important for influencing international opinion. Was it perfect? Ideal? No. But it was important. There were a lot of NGOs that were quietly getting U.S. money that were doing good work. But it was really not the same at all. And whereas so I'll leave that part at that. This question about intra-party democracy, I mean, there's not a lot of method sometimes. I mean, there's not a lot of theory driving what kind of work we do. Why is intra-party democracy important to it's important because it's a drunken man's search. You know what a drunken man's search is? You get home. I know that no one in Georgia drinks, but hypothetically, if you went to a dinner party and drank a lot of wine, and you came home and you tried to get your key in the door and you couldn't because you were drunk, and you dropped the key, where do you look? You look under the streetlight, because it's brighter there, right? And there's a little bit of this with our democracy promotion work. Intra-party democracy is important because it's something we can do. It's something that lends itself to the structures that we have. We can bring people over to do training. We can take parties and bring them together. We can do those things. The evidence suggests we haven't made a lot of progress there. And I don't mean that as a criticism of anybody. But, and I'm not sure it's the biggest problem facing Georgia, but it's the one where our structures are most able to make a difference. Why is West funding ex-officials? That was the third question. I'm sorry, a lot of questions here. Why is it I'm talking fast and not answering as fully as I might? Why is the West funding ex-officials? Two reasons, I think. One, the West supported this government for a long time, and it's going to take a while to really come to terms with the degree of criminality. And I want to choose my words. I want to choose my words carefully there. I'm not saying this was a criminal regime, nor am I saying everybody involved was a criminal, but there was a degree of criminality, and they're going to and corruption, and they're going to take a long time to come to terms with that. The second thing is that there's this constant discussion in Georgia about the state of the opposition. Is the opposition too strong? Is it strong enough? Is it too weak? The problem politically in Georgia, what's missing politically in Georgia is not, and it hasn't for years, has not been an opposition. What's missing is pluralism. But that's much harder to develop. So we stick with we just want some opposition. So maybe we get to more accountability in the system. And this seems like a logical place. I suspect the next Georgian opposition that's serious does not come out of the remnants of the United National Movement. But what do I know? Why your question about NDI and the polls, and I forget your words exactly specifically. I think NDI did good polls. When I saw those polls, I had Charles's reaction. I thought these guys are done. D-U-N, done. The United National Movement cannot win. When you're at 40%, you cannot win, especially in a country where people are not inclined to tell the truth on polls. That was it. My perception was not the one that was shared broadly in Washington. I was obviously wrong because the National Movement got 70 or 80% on election day. The question I'm being facetious there. The question I would ask is not what have they done about their polls. I don't work for NDI. When I need a pollster, I hire one. You know, I mean, I'm not a pollster. Although I have a lot of background in methodology. What the question I would ask is why? Why is this, how does this fit into the democracy promotion mission? I know that they're not paid for by the United States. I know that I think it's Sweden who pays for it, but so you can't say, why are my taxpayer dollars? I'm not asking that question. I'm saying, why is it part of the mission? And I don't see the answer, especially, you know, when you had an election last time where both sides actually had pretty good pollsters, right? So that's, I hope I haven't talked too long.
On the US again, and then Europe shouldn't
Yes. I very much enjoyed hearing your criticism of the concept of transition to democracy, which is a very tempting and poisonous candy, which too many Western scholars and democracy advocates accepted for too long. And it should never appear, the term transition to democracy, in any scholarly article or official publication ever again. I mean, it's like the concept of people's democracy, you know, that it's intrinsically deceptive. Now, we did not understand that. I once didn't understand it, and it's very important to learn from experience. Unfortunately, Americans, like the English, who gave us a big part of our culture, are intrinsically given to wishful thinking. And Americans who live in Washington are even more given to wishful thinking than other Americans. But we need to face that fact and try to overcome it. I think part of the confusion about transition to democracy was because of the loss of the tradition or the loss of the history of liberty as it was understood in the 19th century by people like earlier by people like Hume, Burke, Macaulay, Hippolyte Taine, a wonderful author, who developed a very sophisticated and complex understanding of why revolutions don't work out well. But if you're a revolutionary, you could learn from that how to make a revolution work better than it usually does. And that's what the English accomplished in 1688. And that was all effaced by social science. Looking at a country like Azerbaijan, I think it's particularly important to go back to that teaching, because there may be a revolution around the next election. And it's very important to understand how likely that is to go wrong, and how maybe you could fix those problems if you're aware of them. Part of what has happened in Georgia, which I think has put democracy really within reach here, is that like the English in the 17th century, Georgians went through a long series of disastrous attempts to get liberty, beginning in 1989. But Georgians learned from that experience, like the English did in the 17th century. You know, I think the very heavy vote for Georgian Dream was very much conditioned by the fact that people, a lot of people who, many of whom were not personally attracted to Ivanishvili, wanted to get rid of the national movement, but wanted to do so without a revolution, and therefore thought they had to give a huge vote to Georgian Dream, which worked. And that was a process of social learning. It would be very helpful for the US government to bring that experience to countries like Azerbaijan or well, I think Uzbekistan is out of the question for the time being. Or Armenia, where I think democracy is much further away than in Georgia, but closer than in Azerbaijan. Important to teach this past experience. And I wish the U.S. Embassy funded not only translation of works created in America, but also of the works which created America, which were things like Hobbes, Locke, Hume, etc.
Jana, what I find striking is that often these kind of discussions about these kind of political support for UNM and the kind of favoritism is very much focused on the US.
Yes.
I wouldn't presume that the role of the EU has been kind of
benign,
absolutely neutral and absolutely out of question. So I think we as Europeans now, we shouldn't hide behind the US. What is your take? What should we learn? Or what do you advise European decision makers to learn from the experiences here?
Europeans love hiding behind the that's what we usually do. But no, I mean what Lincoln said about this here also applies in Europe. In Europe, if you are under 50 and speak English and French, you are a Democrat. No, but I think, I mean, on a more serious note, I think Europe has problems criticizing governments that appear to be pro-European. And whether you like it or not, the previous government had a very pro-European rhetoric. And that already was a big change coming from this region. You know, all of a sudden there was somebody saying, yeah, we want to be pro-European, we want to be European, we love Europe. And that to European ears, you know, you don't hear that from Azerbaijan, you don't hear that from Armenia. No, I'm saying about the rhetoric. Look, I'm not defending the policies that he was doing. I'm just explaining that, you know, compared to other countries in the region, this government was seen as more pro-European, That doesn't mean, I think, that many people working on Georgia did not see the problems, but I think the assumption oftentimes was let's not criticize them publicly. And when you ask them, you know, why are we not doing work with, you know, look, they're friends, we can talk to them in private. And that turned out not to be something that is going to change much. You know, this hope that you can meet them and talk to them in private and something will change in practice just didn't work out, and everybody saw it, but it was too late. And I think the other factor, besides this kind of appearance of pro-Europeanism of the previous government was that oftentimes you don't really have the information. I was really stuck. A week ago I was at a conference that had a night owl session on Georgia with the new government's representatives, and the questions the Europeans and Americans asked, most of them, I was really surprised why they came with the questions. Questions like, what's happening with the 40 political prisoners in Georgia? And I was like, where are the 40 political prisoners? Who are they? And I was like, well, we don't know, we just heard about this. And that is part of the problem, that Georgia is sometimes interesting, but for many people, sadly now, who are working on the region, it's not important enough to actually make time and come to the country and learn what is happening and what do people think about the government.
South Caucasus, I mean, that's a geopolitical term, and as Likon mentioned, also it's up to the people from these countries to feel whether there is a proper region that they can develop and can make something out of that. In terms of economics, it's a big space, better than Georgia itself or Azerbaijan on its own. So that in a way, that's how also the policy of the European Union is, to encourage regionalism, but at the same time also have closer relations with the EU. So, but it also depends on what the people themselves see as a way forward.
Okay, we have now a second round of questions and comments. It will be the last one, so I collect some more questions. I have you now. The next speaker.
My name is Uli Kindermann. I work as an integrated expert in the Georgian Ministry of Environment. But before that, I was country manager for the Southern Caucasus for GIZ in Germany. I think for Georgia, the perception of the government appears to me the Western perception appears to me very relationship-based. So the Western governments considered the old government as a friend. So now someone put this government out of power, so there was an assumption that government is probably not your friend. And I think that's what the Western governments are not aware of, that's a credibility problem here in Georgia, because it's clearly seen that there are two set of different criteria how you judge the government. On the old government, a large willingness to focus on the positive aspect and ignore more the negative side. And now a willingness among certain people, also members of the European Parliament recently, to focus on the negative aspect. And I think, talking about credibility, the Western side needs to focus more on objective criteria and also then reflect on their own behavior and consider that maybe they didn't apply objective criteria in the past. I think now talking about objective criteria, that's a big problem for regional cooperation, because if you use objective criteria for, say, example, good governance, that makes it quite difficult to cooperate with Georgia in the same way as you would cooperate with Azerbaijan, because they would probably get different results if you use objective criteria. And I also say that you need, talking about civil society, yesterday someone said that there's a difference between civil society organizations and civil society, and I think it's also, Western governments should be aware that they created a market. I've worked for an Heinrich Boell Foundation supported NGO in Afghanistan, the Tribal Liaison Office, and they had a lot of legitimacy in the local population, but they talked about their local problems, agriculture, infrastructure, whatever. They didn't speak the same language and they didn't use the same buzzwords. So we had a different group of people, which we called the NGI, the non-governmental individuals, mostly fluent in English, speaking all the buzzwords, having a working experience in this international. And they come up with project proposals about gender equality. You wanted something on gender equality, they'd come up with a proposal on that. You wanted conflict resolution, they'd offer something. So it was a market. And there was a demand, and then sooner or later the offer would appear. So I think when you're supporting civil society, it's also be aware that you don't create a market, but you use objective criteria, transparent criteria, and one of them should be legitimacy. Now, one question I would have to the panel is, what I find interesting, there's a large number of international rankings and indicators and all that, and mostly governments don't pay too much attention to that. Georgia was different, I think, because there was at least two indicators they paid a lot of attention, and one was Transparency International Anti-Corruption Index, and the other was the Doing Business Index by the World Bank. So what was happened in Georgia, that national policy was to a very large extent influenced and driven by these indicators because they wanted to improve, so they did a lot of deregulation to improve in doing business indicators. They did a lot of corruption fighting, not because it was popular here, because they wanted their international perception on that to improve. And my perception is that because Georgia did that, Armenia followed at least a bit. I've been to the German Armenia in the business forum in Frankfurt, and the Armenian representative started talking about doing business and transparency indicators as well. So Georgia behavior reacting to this international perception had also effects on at least Armenia's position, and I would like to know if you share that observation that this had a large impact on the former government, these international perceptions. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, maybe this is somehow not a question but comment, but also a question. So first I have to say that from my point of view there is no any special region as South Caucasus. This is just the imperial imagination of the region. Comes from Russian Empire and then Soviet Union. And things are going in different ways in different republics. And coming back to Lincoln, I just want to say that when we are talking about that millions and millions of dollars and euros spending for bringing to the region the democratic transformation, and especially to Azerbaijan, we are forgetting about the dynamics. We are forgetting that things are changing, and for the last 7 or 8 years, millions and millions of dollars and euros spending by Azerbaijani authoritarian regimes in EU countries and USA for lobbying their interests. And if I do not see it clear from Adrian's presentation, but if Europe ends or starts here in the region, and if Azerbaijan now in the circle of European countries, so what we can do to prevent of this influence of this is not only what I want to say, that this is not only one way influence from US and European Union for bringing some kind of transformation. Maybe this is the way back of influence to bringing some kind of authoritarian ideas to the European Union from the margins of Europe.
Interesting question.
I think my question goes to Professor Charles and Adrian. After May 17 events in Tbilisi, many Georgians see the Georgian Orthodox Church as a new political player, which doesn't necessarily recognize all the rules of political fair play, if it exists, of course. And I, as a Georgian, think that Georgian democracy has a new and strong enemy right now, whose power, by the way, was always underestimated in Georgia. Civil society organizations were always disconnected from the public in Georgia. They were always compliant with the requirements of international donors, but they had no idea what was the real needs of general public. So we see a political player, but we don't know its language. We don't know how to speak with them, because perhaps the only way to deal with them is just not to question anything they do or they say. And I'm just wondering, what do you think of the threat of theocracy in Georgia? I know maybe it's exaggerated, but do you think that it is too big, this problem is too big to overlook right now? Thank you.
Heinrich Boell Foundation, Armenia. Thank you for a very interesting session and the entire conference, in fact. the question I have is pretty much following what you were saying. On, in Armenia, there is a pretty constant feeling of conspiracy theory that the local population and the ruling elite, the ruling party, experience vis-à-vis the West. They do cooperate, and if you look at the statistics, the majority of Armenian population does want to almost become European Union members, but it's all based on very much on mistrust. And very often I feel like this is a very temporary alliance, like between the Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. There is a huge level of mistrust, which is demonstrating itself in the fact that any international or internationalized person feel usually walking through the assumption that they are conspirators, that they are working on making the entire Armenia a country of gays and lesbians, full stop. No other perspective, interest. So we want to take the money, we have no other choice, we want all of the goodies, but essentially this is an onslaught on our identity. Of course, there may be some genuine kind of core in that feeling, but it's also very much used by the ruling elite. And the ruling elite itself, it's again very clearly a marriage of convenience, this entire Armenia-EU rapprochement, because Armenia, the ruling elite, is based, the ideology of the ruling party is essentially a Nazi ideology. It's a nationalist, very clearly nationalist national ideology of Karekin Neshtek, the Republican Party. So whenever they declare any European values, it sounds very much against their classic, their Marx or their Lenin, Karekin Neshtek. So my question is, if you, the internationals, experience anything like that in Georgia and Armenia as well, and or if you think that, or others, Georgians and Azerbaijanis, have the same feeling. Because it's my feeling that, despite from what you were saying about May 17, that it's been very easy in Georgia. It was a total and full unity between the people and the Westerners, so to speak. Thank you.
Two more speakers. One is Adrian, please.
Mine is not a question, but a comment I wanted to make about the change of attitude towards international Western donors, organizations. Previously, and especially this was vivid during the post-election period, so previously very much EU, US, or OSCE and these kind of institutions were the places where the local civil society NGOs used to address asking for support and help towards injustices by the government. What was interesting that starting from this changes the credibility issues which you were mentioning, that for example speaking about democracy, but every time after fraudulent elections giving legitimacy to the new government, brought to a level of frustration that this year after elections, one of the human rights defender organizations who had got a Universal Human Rights Award from US Embassy, UK Embassy, OSCE and EU returned it, saying doesn't want to keep it. Some of the activists interfered in the conference when OSCE ODIHR is reading out the statement about election results. And they went to the conference, stopped it, read the findings which the local observer groups had about fraud during the elections. And the message was that if you don't see this kind of thing, that if you think that these elections are still legitimate, then you cannot claim you're expert. It's better not to do the observation at all and just get up. After that, there was also silent protest about ODIHR and obviously international electoral observation missions like utilizing the fraudulent elections. And also back from the Marshall's Park period, already the activists raised the issue of accountability, demanding accountability from international donors for all the support programs that they are doing. Especially one example was with the police. Again, OSCE and US Embassy are doing police training programs, and then police used inadequate force towards the protesters, and so the protesters wrote letters and then had meetings saying that you are not doing your job properly because the police after 4 or 5 years of training is still doesn't behave well, do their job well. And also they were critical about the public comments of representatives of these institutions, because we had cases when on the TV, for example, OSCE representative experts said that if this kind of things happened in the UK, then the police would be even more brutal. And this kind of supported the police to
very much being linked to reality. It's an interesting question. The role of this institute. The second question was the one very interesting. How do we handle with the influence of, let's say, the Azerbaijani or the Azeri lobbies financed by the Azerbaijani government, which is a very rich government, or comparatively rich government. Is there anything we have to take into account much more than until now? And the third block of question, or complex of questions, is related to not only to church again, but to the traditional parts of society or the values in societies. Georg's question also relates to that. Those actors that on the one hand formulate a certain European apprehension or a kind of at the same time breach completely different values internally and perceive the whole EU rapprochement process as a kind of a deal. Yeah? You have to say something in order to get the goodies, and you have to pretend how to deal with that. I think it's a question of high importance, not only in the Caucasus, but for example in the Balkans as well. So who's to start? Charles, and then.
Sure. Let me deal first with the question of the church, because it's a very burning question about the future of Georgia, I think. To begin with, I think we have to make a distinction between democracy and liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is best, but there can be no liberalism without democracy, at least in this part of the world. I mean, maybe in 18th or 19th century Europe, you could have a Rechtsstaat that was relatively liberal but not free. But there is no such option here. So I prioritize democracy, and we have to be clear that democracy means pluralism, which means that people's views have to be represented. And there is a very common view of the kind of NGO class in Georgia that the church is bad and somehow has to be crushed or disregarded in politics. And to me, the political expression of the church is now very bad. But those people have to somehow be represented if we're going to have democracy, which is the most important thing. And therefore, as I said before, I think it's very important to somehow work with the saner elements in the church to enable them to evolve their views in a more constructive direction rather than simply opposing them. In America, it's quite democratic to say the religious right is bad, we're against them, and because democracy is not in question. In Georgia, where we're trying to establish democracy, I think they need to have some kind of representation. Now, whether the church is a strong enemy of democracy, not in the sense of present-day Salafism or Wahhabism, which is a real enemy of democracy by principle. And they're very clear about this, and everywhere that they have won, they got rid of democracy. That shows the church, which is a very composite institution, very flawed, very penetrated by the KGB and by Kudi, its successor, very corrupt, very lots of links to the criminal world, but it's very, very diverse, and the people like Archil Mindiashvili or Eparch Iobi don't equal the church. That's one very strong strand in the church as I understand it. What I see as the great danger is the evolution that occurred among Islamic extremists, where at the time of the Iranian Revolution, there was a desire to somehow square democracy in a kind of leftist interpretation with Islamic fanaticism. And over time, particularly among Sunnis, that evolved into a clear, rigid, anti-democratic agenda. I would not say that that's happened yet in Georgia, because the church is the enemy of the West and not the enemy of democracy. And that's important because the West, being democratic, is also its own enemy. I mean, I think the American sort of conservative voice is useful because it's very much against some tendencies in the West. About the church, I think it's important to ask the question, what does theocracy mean? I mean, certainly a Georgia in which it doesn't, I think, it means a lot of bad things. It doesn't mean theocracy in the sense of Tibet or Iran, or at least it doesn't mean that yet. And it's important not to let it evolve in that direction. Very quickly, I'm afraid the record of OSCE, ODIHR, and even more of things like PACE, election monitoring, has in many cases been really shameful. And it's the responsibility of the governments that are most influential there to correct the abuse of our neutral observation capabilities, which are so very important in the development of democracy. Finally, on these indices, they too seem to me very corrupt. I cannot understand how the World Bank can say it's easy to do business in Georgia under the national movement, which was an extraordinarily corrupt, had a corrupt relationship of politicized business and money-making government, who were densely woven together. And what can I say? I mean, that's also shameful. How could the World Bank do this? I wish someone would tell me.
Thanks. I mean, just very briefly on the role of the church. You know, it's a difficult question. The church is a socially conservative institution everywhere. You have debates in Ireland and elsewhere, and I don't want to relativize the discussion here, obviously. But what I think is, I hope that the events of 17th of May would serve as a wake-up call to civil society, but also to the government. Because lots of the challenges that Georgia is facing are related, and you always hear that, you know, social, economic, foreign relations, and so on. And now all of a sudden this question of, all right, what can a Georgian nation agree on are the social values? You know, what is the consensus and how can we talk to each other? That has not been answered yet. So I just hope that, you know, as awful as it was, I hope it was a wake-up call rather than something that is going to kind of continue the tensions even more. But, you know, rather an incentive to start building bridges and talking. One quick point of Azerbaijan now, and Azerbaijan is not only lobbying. I mean, they've now launched a call for European and American NGOs to apply for funds to support human rights issues in Azerbaijan, which I found amazing and brave in so many ways, in wrong way. But you know, I wrote a paper with Leila Alieva, the expert, not the one related to the family, on the totally false choice the EU is trying to make or presents itself in Azerbaijan. For one simple reason, unlike some other countries, Azerbaijan is actually interested in Europe. They don't want to be seen as an international pariah. They don't want to be called autocratic regime. They want to send their children to Western schools. They want to go shopping to the Western shopping malls. We are not using the leverage at all. And I just feel that I should just republish the paper again, and I'm worried that I will have to republish it next year and the year afterwards.
Turning about the ranking, the problem is, again, it was the methodology with doing the business. In 2007, it was heavily criticized by the US Congress, but who takes the care? You know, you can say anything you can in the country, so. And I remember discussion with the World Bank Spanish director when he was asking me, and how Georgia managed to be more attractive for business than Spain. And I was saying, you know, it's your business, it's not my business. But this is the problem, you know. It's the same as with the anti-corruption, which is done by the Transparency International, and the methodology is good. It doesn't really monitors the elite corruption, and it reveals all these relations. So this is the good thing for the public relations and selling the country. The problem here I see is that the decision makers from the other countries should not be both by this kind of I would say, cheap things, and should not repeat it in the different speeches, because they, at least, I am sure here, they well understand where there's a problem with the methodology and those kind of things. About how to handle the influence of the Azerbaijan, the Western government, it's not only the Azerbaijan, for example, the Armenian mining sector are doing almost the same with the major superpowers, I would say, around the world. And here, and the Saakashvili government was doing this for its own political thing. So here I think the receipt is like very honest assessment what is going into the countries, and the real understanding that we, the South Caucasus, we need more the world than the world needs us. When this parity somehow is changed because of some kind of the PR actions, then the troubles is beginning, because the oil from Azerbaijan, it doesn't go to the European Union. If you look, where it ends in the Israel. So Israel, at the end of the day, will find where from to take the oil if the and this doesn't really prevent the member states, for example, to really say very critical things about the Azerbaijan, but all this kind of, and first of all, looking within the European Union for the energy security, not outside of the European Union, it's easiest way out, I would say. And the Germany, for example, is the best example that they are doing that. About the Georgian church, this is, I would not ask about what we can do with the church, because I really don't know, but it was not unexpected, I would say. I would say what we here as a civil society really lacking here. We often, for past years, it looks like we lack the interaction with the people. And when there is no interaction, people tend to go and listen to everybody. So we really need to compete, I guess, with the church. I think a month ago I get some fellow from the GPAS. She was doing some research, and she really strikes me very badly when she said that we have been only in jail who said to them that we are working with local communities. Maybe because of this character of our work, of the campaigns and environmental policy changes couldn't be done without local communities. But I couldn't imagine any, sustainable policy change, even in judiciary, if it's not understood by the people, not all people, but somebody, the requirements there is not based on the needs of these people. So here I think we need really to start to compete with the church, not really in terms of giving more lectures, giving more civic education. I think here is again, because this is only receipt for my...
I'm not an expert at all in the Georgian, Georgian church, but I have a couple of thoughts. The first is that one of the major tasks of democracy historically is to kind of curb religious power. So this goes to the very heart of democratic development and needs to be taken seriously as such. In the 21st century, religiosity is one of the driving issues in many democratic countries, not just the United States, where it's very front and center. So this is to a great extent what democracy is about. Democracy should not be about beating people up because they want gay people to be treated equally. That's brutality, that's a pogrom. But there has to be institutions so that these issues can be discussed, but they're going to be discussed. The church is very powerful, and the people who believe them are very numerous, and we can't get around that. I like this idea of competing, but there also is the side of engaging. I think Charles knows more about the Georgian church than I do, but it sounds like there is maybe some diversity of views there, and trying to get a better sense of that, and trying to maybe push for changes within the church. But I don't think we've engaged as much as the church as we might have. What was the slogan about meddling? We don't meddle with the church, and maybe we should meddle with the church more. There was a battery of questions here that have to do with how the West, how Europe, how the people here see Europe. And this includes, in my view, this question about rankings and the question about influence peddling abroad. Because, if you're American or from Western Europe, and you ask yourself, why are you here? Why are we here? The answer is because we won the Cold War. If things had turned out differently, you would be, in my neighborhood in New York, trying to show me how to be a better communist, whatever that would have meant in the 21st century, in that alternative universe. So I assume many of us are grateful we don't live in that alternative universe. I am grateful, but
that the truth is we are here because of that. And that can't be forgotten. And there is an implicit power dynamic here. The United States and our European allies are richer and more powerful than the three countries of this region. And that is why. Why do we create indices? Because we can. And yes, the Georgian government, to put it in colloquial language, teaches for the test. But if you give people indices, they're going to teach for the test. It gets, Russia has indices too. Does anybody take Russia's indices seriously? I don't know. I don't particularly, but why do they have indices? Because it drives the United States crazy, right? Russia has its own kind of, if you want to read, the alternate universe of the ODIHR report, read it's in my mind, but the CIS report on an election, right? We've set ourselves up as the arbiters of objectivity because of our power and because we won the Cold War. And sometimes we actually are objective. And I believe in many cases we are trying to do the right thing. Too many people have spent too many hours here trying to make this region more democratic. It doesn't mean we're always getting it right. But this question of why are we having these indices? How do we see each other, right? Being European here, to go back to the Zurabzvanya quote that you said, it's an achieved status. When there are, I don't know, I'm making this number up, but I'm not wrong, about 70 million people in the United States who are from Irish or Italian descent, right? Their families came over as immigrants, we all know that story. When they came over, they were seen as black. Not white, black. Because, and this was in a very racist country, which was, in many cases, a few years removed from chattel slavery and had basically an apartheid regime in most of the country. We're talking the late 19th century. Why were they seen as black? I don't know, go read the books. But largely because they were Catholic. But the point is, being white was an achieved status. Being white is something made up. There's no such thing as being white, right? We use this racist term Caucasian, which is funny here, but it's not funny in America. But it doesn't mean anything to be white, right? It's an achieved status. Being European is also an achieved status. And a lot of the elites here across the political spectrum have bought into that. And therefore, it means something. And to tie it back to May 17th, supporting those marchers is the right thing to do for a whole range of reasons. I'm talking about the people peacefully marching against homophobia, not the thugs who beat them up. Supporting those marches is the right thing to do for a whole lot of moral reasons. But sometimes people do the right thing for not necessarily the right reason. Signaling that you support those marchers is a way of signaling that you're European. To put it in 19th century terms, you're not white until you're pro-gay rights, except that's a strange mixed metaphor. But you're not European, really, until you are. But that rubs people the wrong way. As frankly, it should, right? These are values coming from the outside that have not, for which there's not been enough debate about, enough discussion. I mean, I grew up in a city where one day somebody walked into City Hall, shot the mayor at point blank range, walked down a few doors away, and shot another elected official at point blank range, killed them both. He got a slap on the wrist. If he had only killed the mayor, he'd still be in jail today, 35 years later. Why did he get a slap on the wrist? Because the other guy was gay. And that means he got less time in jail. And that's my lifetime, and I'm not that old. This takes a while. And we've not done anything as outsiders to facilitate that change. Except that some people want that change for good reasons, and some people see it as it's an achieved status. Sorry.
Two points I wanted to make on the church. The language of the church is clearly anti-Western, and that's been mentioned. I just want to, on the question of theocracy, I think it's interesting to look back at the pre-Soviet and pre-Imperial Russian Georgian relation between the church and the king, and it was very interesting that then I don't remember exactly whether it was Vakhtang the sixth or Erkel the second that had this what we can see today as the concordat, where the power of the king was equal to the power of the patriarch. So it has never, in a way, in the Georgian history of the past history, it has never been the case that the church would go, to that extent. But to our present situation, I agree with the point that there should be more for competing spaces, competing against the churches, the building of the churches. So there will be much more public spaces for the people where they can talk about different things besides religious. And that was it.
Well, thank you very much. We have reached the end of our today's conference with intense discussions. Of course, I will not even try to sum up what we've been discussing here during today. I just would like to make 3 points that directly affect our work of the Heinrich Boell Foundation as a small, not very relevant, but non-governmental organization, which has the privilege to be non-governmental and not being bound to intergovernmental agreements. First, the question of civil society without society, or as the title of one of our publications, Actors Without Society, the problem of the NGO business and how do you position yourself in this business. I think what we've been trying to do over all these 10 years is to be as transparent as possible, to be as open as possible for everybody who is interested in what we are doing, to really reach out, and the most important thing is to open up public space for discussion on values, on controversial values, not just import values and say these are European values, but to discuss about values. What do you mean by this or that? I think this is something we've tried to do over the years. The second one is the question of credibility. Of course, it is a very, very difficult one, and this is why I'm talking about our privilege of not being in a governmental position, which would change things seriously. But one thing, of course, is trying to be informed, trying to spend as much as possible into getting information, being well connected, and really trying to understand, and then to speak out as much as possible. There's no reason to conceal human rights violations or lack of separation of power, things like that. Definitely not. And the more not for non-governmentals, and this was the most shocking observation I've made, how often non-governmental organizations conceal human rights violations. This is what I really cannot understand. And the third point is, well, the eternal question about the region. I think it's quite clear to everybody, South Caucasus is politically not a region, but you're still neighbors. And as such, I think it is extremely important to keep this kind of contacts, this kind of networks working. I found it this time again very interesting and very useful to have this kind of exchange between neighboring countries, and you cannot get rid of your neighbors. So anyway, neighbors remain to be important, and therefore this relationship between the countries of this geographical region, they remain important, and I'm happy that we have, with our limited capacities, that we have this kind of regional South Caucasus office, which offers us at least the opportunity to try to reach out to all these 3 countries. Well, thank you very much, first of all, Charles, Jana, Manana, Lincoln, and Adrian for this. I found it personally very interesting and frank panel. Thank you, Nino, and your team, Tamuna, Manana, Maikas, Fatuna, and everybody else for organizing this really interesting conference. I imagine what kind of workload this was. Thank you, our interpreters, who did a great job yesterday and today, very much. And don't miss our birthday party this evening. I'm sure Nino, who's great on all things on all questions of culture, has prepared a very attractive, interesting program for tonight. So we start at 7 here at the Goethe Institute, and thank you again for your participation, your interest, and stay in touch. Thank you.